Today we were continuing with Unit 5 and multiplying rational numbers, and we focused a lot on fractions and decimals. But first, let's review. 2 times 3 meant that we had two groups of 3 balloons. And so that was equal to positive 6. 2 times negative 3 meant we had two groups of 3 weights. And so we were left with 6 weights, or negative 6. And then negative 2 times negative 3, we were thinking about it as taking away two groups of 3 weights, which meant we were going up, and so we ended up at positive 6. So when we multiply two positives, we get a positive. And when we multiply a positive and a negative, and it doesn't matter what order we multiply in, we always end up with a negative. And when we multiply two negatives, we end up with a positive. And it said, find the product of each of the following. What do you notice about the amount of negatives in the problem and the sign of the solution? Letter A, negative 3 times 4 is negative 12. And then we multiply negative 12 times 2, and we get negative 24. And negative 24 times negative 1 gave us positive 24. Notice these first several are the same, it's just different numbers are negative. So now negative 3 times negative 4 is positive 12. And positive 12 times 2 is positive 24. And positive 24 times negative 1 is negative 24. Negative 3 times negative 4 is positive 12. 12 times negative 2 gives us negative 24. And negative 24 times negative 1 is positive 24. Negative 3 times negative 4, positive 12, times negative 2 is negative 24, times negative 1 is positive 24, times negative 1 is negative 24. Letter E, negative 3 times negative 4 is positive 12. Positive 12 times negative 2 gives me negative 24. Times negative 1 is positive 24. Times negative 1 is negative 24. Times negative 1 is positive 24. Negative 3 times negative 4 is 12. Times negative 2 is negative 24. Times negative 1 is positive 24. Times negative 1 is negative 24. Times negative 1 is positive 24. Times negative 1 is negative 24. And the last one, negative 3 times negative 4 is positive 12. Times negative 2 is negative 24. Times 0 gives me 0. Times negative 1 is still 0. Times negative 1 is still 0. So thinking about the number of negatives and our answer. Well, in letter A, we had 2 negatives, and our answer was positive. Letter B, we had 3 negatives. Our answer was negative. Letter C, 4 negatives. The answer was positive. Letter D, 5 negatives. Our answer was negative. Letter E, we had 6 negatives, and our answer was positive. Letter F, we had 7 negatives, and our answer was negative. Now, letter G, we had 5 negatives, But we also had a 0 in there, and 0 times anything is 0. So for right now, let's just focus on A, B, C, D, E, and F. And what we noticed, I'm going to look at the positive ones. 2, 4, 6, those are even numbers. So when we have an even amount of negatives, our answer will be positive, because every negative has a partner to make it positive. If we have an odd amount of negatives, our answer is going to be negative, because somebody will always be left out without a partner. Then we talked about multiplying fractions. And to multiply fractions, we multiply across. So in the letter A, 3, we're going to do 3 times 6 over 5 times 7, which gives us 18 over 35. And because we have a positive times a negative, my answer is negative 18/35. And we should check to make sure that we can't simplify, and 18 and 35 do not have any common factors. For letter B, with the mixed number, this is where we want to change to an improper fraction. 8 times 2 is 16, plus 1 is 17. So I have negative 17/8 times negative 4/5. And we have a negative times a negative, so my answer is going to be positive. 17 times 4 is going to be negative 68. Positive 68. And 8 times 5 is 40. Now, both of those are even. So I know I can divide by 2. But also, if I look at the numerator and the denominator, I have a 4 and an 8. And so there's a common factor of 4 for those. So I'm going to actually divide by 4. And we get 17/10, or 1 7/10. And then multiplying decimals. So we multiply like whole numbers. That's our first step. So I'm going to multiply 23 times 15. And 5 times 3 is 15. 5 times 2 is 10. Plus 1 is 11. 0. I have 10. 1 times 3 is 3. 2 times 1 is 2. And then we add those 5, 4, and 3. And we count the number of digits after the decimal points. In this case, there's 2, so we move our final decimal point 2 places. So here's my decimal point after the 5. So 1, 2, so 3 and 45/100ths, but it's a negative times a positive, so negative 3 and 45/100ths. And then we just practice some 7 and 9/10 times 10. Well, anytime I move multiply by 10, I can just move the decimal point to the right, so 79. Negative 6 sevenths times 7, so I'm going to put the whole number over 1 and then multiply across. 6 times 7 is 42. 7 times 1 is 7. A negative times a positive is a negative. But this can simplify down to negative 6. If I skip down here to this fraction one, I multiply, well, first off, it's a negative times a positive, so I'm going to have a negative. 5 times 13 is 65. 2 times 4 is 8. I could leave it like that, or I could change it to a mixed number, negative 8 and 1/8. And down here, if I do this last decimal one, I'm going to multiply 16 times 5 to get 60. Sorry, not 60, 80. There's one digit, so I move the decimal point over. So now I have 8, and it's negative 8. So now I'm going to multiply 292 by 8. 8 times 2 is 16. 8 times 9 is 72, plus 1 is 73. 8 times 2 is 16, plus 7 is 23. There's one digit after the decimal point, so I need to move my decimal point over 1. 233 and 6/10. But it's a negative times a negative, so my final answer is positive. If we did the 2 and 5/10 times negative 3 and 25/100, I would treat it as 325 times 25. 5 times 5 is 25. 5 times 2 is 10, plus 2 is 12. 5 times 3 is 15, plus 1 is 16. 2 times 5 is 10. 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5. 2 times 3 is 6. And we add those together. 5, 2, 11, and 8. Now I have 1, 2, 3 digits after the decimal point. So 1, 2, 3. And it's a positive times a negative. So my final answer is negative 8 and 125 thousandths.